The knock on my door came at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, and I knew immediately it was going to be trouble because nobody knocks on doors at that hour unless they're delivering bad news or selling religion. I was still in my bathrobe, coffee cup in hand, when I opened the door to find a woman in her mid-40s with blonde highlights and a clipboard clutched against her chest, like it was a shield protecting her from the world. "Zachary Newman?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew exactly who I was. "That's me," I said, taking a sip of my coffee and trying to wake up enough to deal with whatever this was about. "I'm Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I've received several complaints about livestock on your property, and I'm here to inform you that you're in direct violation of Section 4.7 of our community guidelines, which explicitly prohibits the keeping of farm animals within residential lots." I blinked at her, processing what she just said while my brain was still trying to boot up for the day. "Farm animals? I don't have any farm animals." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line, and she shifted her clipboard to point past me toward my backyard. "Your chickens, Mr. Newman. 3 residents have filed formal complaints about the noise, the smell, and the presence of livestock in a residential neighborhood." "There's 6 chickens," I said, feeling my blood pressure starting to rise. "6 hens. They're quieter than most dogs in this neighborhood, and they don't smell because I clean their coop twice a week. Be that as it may, the HOA covenants are very clear on this matter. You have 14 days to remove the animals from your property, or we'll be forced to begin fining you $500 per day until you achieve compliance." She pulled a sheet of paper from her clipboard and handed it to me. "This is your official notice. Have a good day, Mr. Newman." She turned and walked back down my driveway before I could respond, climbing into a silver Lexus SUV with a license plate frame that read "Live, Laugh, Love" in swirling script. I stood there in my doorway, staring at the notice in my hand while my coffee went cold. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 8 months earlier after my divorce was finalized. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch on a 1/4-acre lot, nothing fancy, but it had a decent backyard and good bones. I'd gotten the chickens 3 months ago, partly because I'd always wanted them and partly because my therapist had suggested finding a hobby that would get me outside and give me something to care for. The chickens had been perfect. They were low maintenance, entertaining to watch, and they gave me fresh eggs every morning. My kids, Emma and Jake, loved visiting on weekends and collecting eggs from the nesting boxes I'd built. I went back inside and read through the notice more carefully. Section 4.7 of the Meadowbrook Estates covenants did indeed prohibit livestock, farm animals, or poultry on residential properties. But there was something that bothered me about the whole thing. When I'd bought the house, I'd specifically asked my real estate agent about chickens because I'd been planning to get them eventually. She'd told me to check the local ordinances, which I had. Cedar Rapids allowed up to 25 chickens on residential properties within city limits, no permit required. I'd never thought to check the HOA rules because, frankly, I'd barely registered that there was an HOA. Nobody had mentioned it during closing, and I'd never received any welcome packet or information about meetings. I spent the rest of that day digging through the paperwork from when I'd bought the house. Buried in a stack of closing documents, I finally found a single page that referenced the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association and stated that by purchasing property within the subdivision, I agreed to abide by all covenants and restrictions. There was a website listed where I could supposedly access the full covenant document, but when I tried to visit it, I got an error message saying the page didn't exist. That evening, I called my neighbor, Frank Morrison, who'd lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 15 years. Frank was a retired postal worker in his 70s, and we'd become friendly over the past few months. He'd been the one who helped me install the chicken coop, actually. "Frank, did you know there was an HOA in this neighborhood?" I asked when he picked up. "Oh yeah, but it's been pretty much inactive for years," he said. "When I first moved here, they used to have quarterly meetings and collect dues and all that, but participation dropped off. Last I heard, they couldn't even get a quorum together to vote on anything. Why do you ask?" I told him about Patricia's visit and the notice I'd received. Frank was quiet for a moment. "That's strange. Patricia Hendricks just bought her house here about a year ago. I didn't even know she'd gotten herself elected president. The old board basically dissolved around 2018 because nobody wanted to deal with it anymore. Most of the original homeowners have moved out over the years, and the newer folks didn't really care about maintaining the HOA. So, is she even legitimate?" I asked. "That's a good question. You might want to look into that. There's supposed to be a process for electing board members, and it requires notice to all homeowners and a proper vote. If she just declared herself president, that's not going to hold up." I thanked Frank and hung up, feeling slightly more optimistic. Maybe this was all going to be a big misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a few phone calls. I was wrong. The next morning, I sent a polite email to the address listed on the notice, explaining that I'd like to discuss the situation and asking for information about when the board election had been held. I got an automated response saying my email had been received and someone would get back to me within 3 business days. On Thursday, I received a second notice, this one more aggressive in tone. It informed me that my continued defiance of the HOA rules was unacceptable, and that if I didn't remove the chickens immediately, they would seek an injunction to force compliance. The notice was signed by Patricia Hendricks and 2 other board members I'd never heard of, Deborah Walsh and Kenneth Cooper. I decided it was time to do some research. I started by pulling up the property records for Meadowbrook Estates and making a list of all the homeowners. There were 83 houses in the subdivision. Then I started making phone calls. By the end of the weekend, I'd spoken with 37 of my neighbors. None of them had received any notice about an HOA board election. Most of them didn't even know there was an active HOA anymore. 3 of them had the same story. They'd received aggressive notices from Patricia about various violations, everything from leaving their garbage cans visible from the street to having the wrong color mailbox. 2 had just paid the fines because it was easier than fighting. 1, a woman named Susan Delacroix, who lived 4 streets over, told me she tried to contest a fine, and Patricia had threatened to put a lien on her house. "She's absolutely ruthless," Susan said. "I ended up paying her $2,000 for having a vegetable garden in my front yard." According to her, it violated the landscaping requirements. But I've lived here for 12 years, and I've had that garden for 8 of them. Nobody ever said anything about it until she showed up. I was starting to see a pattern. On Monday morning, I called a lawyer. The attorney's name was Michael Foster, and he specialized in real estate and HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Cedar Rapids, in one of those renovated historic buildings with exposed brick and modern furniture that was trying very hard to look casual and approachable. "The first thing we need to determine is whether the HOA board is legitimate," Michael said after I'd explained the situation. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that probably came from dealing with angry people all day. In Iowa, HOAs are governed by the Iowa Nonprofit Corporation Act. If Meadowbrook Estates has an HOA, it should be registered as a nonprofit corporation with the Secretary of State. Let me look that up. He typed on his computer for a moment, then frowned. Okay, so there is a corporation registered under Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and it was formed in 1998. But according to this, the last filing they made was in 2017. They're actually not in good standing because they haven't filed their required biennial reports. What does that mean for me? I asked. It means the HOA probably doesn't have the legal authority to enforce anything right now, Michael said. But that's not your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is that even if the HOA were in good standing, they still have to follow their own bylaws when it comes to enforcement. And from what you've told me, it doesn't sound like they've done that. You said you never received a hearing or an opportunity to contest the violation. Nope. Just the notice telling me I had 14 days. That's not how it's supposed to work. The HOA covenants should outline a process for violations, including notice, an opportunity to be heard, and an appeals process. If they're skipping all that and going straight to fines and threats, they're not following their own rules. He leaned back in his chair. Here's what I recommend. First, send them a formal response disputing the violation and requesting a hearing before the board. Second, request copies of all the HOA governing documents, including the bylaws, covenants, and any amendments. Third, ask them to provide proof that the current board was properly elected according to the bylaws. Make it all very formal and legal sounding. That usually slows people down. What if they don't respond? I asked. Then we file a lawsuit and let a judge sort it out, but it probably won't come to that. Most of these HOA power trip situations fall apart once someone actually pushes back with legal representation. I paid Michael his retainer and left feeling better about the situation, though I was also frustrated that I had to spend money on a lawyer just to keep my 6 chickens in my own backyard. That afternoon, I sent the formal response Michael had helped me draft. It was 3 pages long and used a lot of words like heretofore and pursuant to, and it made me feel very official and lawyerly. The response came faster than I expected. The next morning, I had an email from Patricia Hendricks herself, and it was clear she was not happy. Mr. Newman, it began, with no greeting or pleasantries. Your disrespectful and frivolous response has been received. The HOA board has no obligation to provide you with a hearing or justify our legal authority. By purchasing property in Meadowbrook Estates, you agreed to abide by all covenants and restrictions, and you are currently in violation. If you do not remove the livestock from your property by the original deadline of May 15th, you will be fined $500 per day, and we will pursue all available legal remedies, including placing a lien on your property. This is your final warning. I forwarded the email to Michael, who called me 20 minutes later. Well, she's certainly confident, he said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. But she's also completely wrong about almost everything in that email. I think we need to escalate this a bit. I'm going to send a letter on firm letterhead explaining exactly why her position is incorrect and why the HOA's actions are improper. That should get her attention. Do you think it'll work? I asked. Honestly, I don't know. Some people back down as soon as they see lawyer letterhead. Others double down because they can't stand the idea of being wrong. My gut tells me Patricia is the doubling down type. He was right. Michael's letter went out on Wednesday. By Friday, I had a new notice from the HOA, this one informing me that I was being fined not just for the chickens, but also for unauthorized structures, because apparently my chicken coop required HOA architectural approval before construction. Failure to maintain landscaping standards, because there was a small patch of clover in my front lawn, and creating a nuisance because of the alleged smell and noise from the chickens. The total fines came to $7,000. I stared at the notice in disbelief. This had gone from annoying to absolutely insane in less than 2 weeks. "She's trying to bury you in violations to force you to comply," Michael said when I called him. "It's a bullying tactic." The good news is that it makes our case stronger if we end up in court. Judges don't like this kind of obvious harassment. The bad news is that it's going to be stressful and expensive to fight. "What are my options?" I asked. "We can file a lawsuit seeking a declaratory judgment that the HOA's actions are improper and seeking to invalidate the fines. We can also potentially sue for harassment and abuse of process. But litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Or you could just get rid of the chickens and move on with your life." I thought about that for a long moment. The practical part of my brain said that 6 chickens weren't worth thousands of dollars in legal fees. But the stubborn part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through a difficult divorce and a career change and a complete life upheaval, said that backing down to a bully was never the right choice. "Let's file the lawsuit," I said. That weekend, I was out in my backyard cleaning the chicken coop when Emma and Jake came running out of the house. They were 9 and 11, respectively, and they'd been inside watching TV while I did chores. "Dad, there's a lady at the front door and she seems really mad," Emma said, her eyes wide. I sighed and set down the rake I'd been using. "Stay here, both of you." I walked around to the front of the house and found Patricia Hendricks standing on my porch, arms crossed, with 2 people I didn't recognize flanking her like backup singers. "Mr. Newman, I'm here with the HOA board to conduct an inspection of your property," Patricia announced. "No, you're not," I said calmly. "You don't have permission to be on my property and I'm asking you to leave. The HOA covenants give us the right to inspect properties for violations," she said, her voice rising. "The covenants might say that, but Iowa law says you can't enter someone's private property without permission or a warrant. You need to leave. Now." One of the people with her, a thin man in his 50s who I assumed was Kenneth Cooper, stepped forward. "We're not leaving until we've documented all the violations on this property. You're breaking the rules, and you need to face the consequences." My kids had come around to the front yard despite my instructions to stay put. I could see them standing by the corner of the house, watching the confrontation with worried faces. "I'm going to say this one more time," I said, keeping my voice level even though I was furious. "You need to leave my property immediately, or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead and call them," Patricia said with a nasty smile. "We're not doing anything wrong. You're the one who's violating the law by keeping farm animals in a residential neighborhood." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The Cedar Rapids Police Department sent an officer within 15 minutes. His name was Officer David Chen, and he listened patiently while both sides explained the situation. "Madam, he's asking you to leave his property," Officer Chen finally said to Patricia. "You need to go. If you have a legal dispute, you need to resolve it through the courts, not by trespassing on his property." "This is not trespassing," Patricia insisted. "The HOA has a legal right to conduct inspections." "Not without the homeowner's permission, you don't," Officer Chen said, his tone becoming firmer. "I'm not going to ask you again. Either you leave voluntarily or I'm going to have to cite you for trespassing." Patricia's face turned red, but she finally turned and stalked back to her Lexus. Kenneth and the other board member, who I assumed was Deborah Walsh, followed her. Before getting into her car, Patricia turned back and pointed at me. "This isn't over, Mr. Newman. Not by a long shot, After they left, Officer Chen turned to me. "I'm going to write up a report on this incident. If they come back without permission, call us immediately. You might also want to consider getting a restraining order if this continues." "Thank you, officer," I said. After he left, I sat down with Emma and Jake and tried to explain what was happening in terms they could understand. They were both upset, and Emma started crying because she thought someone was going to take the chickens away. "Nobody's taking the chickens," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure I could keep that promise. "Daddy's handling it, okay? Everything's going to be fine." That night, after I'd taken the kids back to their mother's house, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to figure out my next move. The legal route was going to take time and money, and there was no guarantee I'd win. I needed something else, some angle I hadn't thought of yet. I spent the next several hours searching through Iowa agricultural laws, city ordinances, and anything else I could find related to keeping chickens. Around midnight, I stumbled across something interesting. Iowa had what was called a right to farm law, which protected agricultural operations from nuisance lawsuits and local restrictions. But more interestingly, the state had provisions for agricultural exemptions on residential properties. According to Iowa Code Chapter 352, property owners could apply for an agricultural exemption if they were using their land for agricultural purposes, even if it was a small-scale operation. The exemption provided certain protections, including exemption from some local restrictions that conflicted with state agricultural policy. I dug deeper and found that Lynn County, where Cedar Rapids was located, had a program for agricultural exemptions for small-scale farming operations, including poultry. The requirements were minimal. You needed to demonstrate that you were engaged in bona fide agricultural activity, maintain proper records, and follow basic health and safety standards. The more I read, the more excited I got. If I could get an agricultural exemption from the state, it might supersede the HOA restrictions. It was a long shot, but it was worth pursuing. The next morning, I started the application process. It required documentation of my agricultural activities, so I took photos of the chickens, the coop, and my egg production records. I'd been keeping track of how many eggs each hen laid, partly because I was curious and partly because I'm the kind of person who likes data. I also needed to show that I was selling or distributing the eggs, so I made a list of the neighbors and friends I'd been giving eggs to, along with dates and approximate quantities. The application also required a letter explaining the purpose and scope of the agricultural activity. I spent hours crafting that letter, explaining how the chickens provided fresh eggs for my family, reduced food waste because they ate kitchen scraps, and gave my kids an education about where food comes from and the importance of sustainable living. I talked about how I'd been carefully researching proper chicken care and how I'd built a coop that exceeded all recommended standards for space and ventilation. I even mentioned that I'd started a small composting operation using the chicken manure, which I was using to grow vegetables in a raised bed garden. I submitted the application on a Tuesday and was told it would take 4 to 6 weeks to process. In the meantime, the HOA situation continued to deteriorate. I received another notice informing me that the fines had started accruing at $500 per day, and that the total was now up to $12,000. Michael filed our lawsuit in Lynn County District Court, seeking to invalidate the fines and enjoin the HOA from further harassment. Patricia responded by filing a counterclaim seeking not just the fines, but also attorney's fees and damages for my allegedly causing the HOA to incur legal expenses. This is what happens when someone with a little bit of power decides to abuse it, Michael said during one of our phone calls. She's dug in so deep now that backing down would mean admitting she was wrong, and people like her never admit they're wrong. The legal process ground forward slowly. We had a preliminary hearing where the judge listened to both sides and declined to issue a preliminary injunction, which meant the HOA couldn't force me to remove the chickens while the lawsuit was pending, but they could continue to claim I owed them fines. It was a mixed result that satisfied nobody. During this time, I became something of a minor celebrity in the neighborhood. The story of my fight with the HOA spread, and I started getting visits from neighbors I'd never met before, most of them expressing support. Several of them shared their own stories of Patricia's aggressive enforcement tactics. One neighbor, a man named Robert Chang who lived 2 streets over, told me that Patricia had fined him $1,000 for parking his work van in his driveway. He was a plumber and the van had his company logo on it. According to Patricia, commercial vehicles weren't allowed to be visible from the street. I just paid the fine because I couldn't afford to fight it, Robert said. I'm a small business owner. I don't have money for lawyers. But I'm really glad you're standing up to her. Another neighbor, Jennifer Martinez, had been fined for putting up a little free library box in her front yard without HOA approval. The fine had been $1,500, which she'd also paid rather than fight. The more I heard, the angrier I got. Patricia wasn't enforcing rules to maintain property values or keep the neighborhood nice. She was using the HOA as a personal fiefdom where she could bully people and extract money from them. I started organizing. I created a Facebook group called Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners' Rights and invited everyone I'd spoken with. Within a week, we had 47 members. I shared everything I'd learned about the HOA's questionable legal status, Patricia's election that nobody seemed to remember happening, and the fact that the nonprofit corporation wasn't even in good standing with the state. We decided to force a special meeting of the HOA membership. According to the bylaws I'd finally managed to obtain, any 20 homeowners could petition for a special meeting. We got 34 signatures in less than 3 days. Patricia tried to ignore the petition, but Michael sent her a letter explaining that under Iowa law, she was required to hold the meeting within 30 days, or the homeowners could hold it themselves, and any votes taken would be valid. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the Meadowbrook Estates clubhouse, which was really just a small building with a kitchen and a multi-purpose room that probably hadn't been used in years. The turnout was incredible. 62 of the 83 homeowners showed up, which was way more than the quorum required by the bylaws. Patricia sat at a folding table at the front of the room with Kenneth Cooper and Deborah Walsh, all 3 of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I'd prepared an agenda for the meeting, which I'd submitted to Patricia in advance as required by the bylaws. The first item was a vote of no confidence in the current board. The second was an election for a new board. The third was a vote to rescind all fines that had been issued in the past year. Patricia tried to take control of the meeting from the start. "This meeting is out of order," she announced. "The current board has not approved this agenda, and we will not be voting on any of these items." Frank Morrison, who'd been elected as temporary chairman of the meeting by the homeowners who'd organized the petition, stood up. "Patricia, you don't get to decide whether this meeting is in order. The bylaws are very clear. When homeowners call a special meeting, they set the agenda, not the board. Now, you can either participate in this meeting according to the rules or you can leave, but we're moving forward either way." Patricia's face turned purple, but she stayed seated. The vote of no confidence was overwhelming. 58 homeowners voted in favor, 2 voted against, and 2 abstained. Patricia, Kenneth, and Deborah were officially removed from the board. The election for the new board took longer. We'd prepared a slate of candidates in advance, people who'd been active in the homeowners' rights group and who were committed to running the HOA fairly and transparently. Frank Morrison was elected president. Susan Delacroix, the woman who'd been fined for her vegetable garden, was elected vice president. 3 other homeowners were elected to fill out the 5-person board. The vote to rescind the fines was also overwhelming. Every fine that Patricia had issued in the past year was voided, including the $12,000 she'd claimed I owed for the chickens. After the votes were tallied, Patricia stood up and grabbed her purse. "This is illegal," she hissed. "I'm going to sue all of you for conspiracy and defamation, and whatever else my lawyer can think of." "You do that, Patricia," Frank said calmly. "In the meantime, you're no longer on the board and you no longer have any authority to act on behalf of this HOA. If you continue to send notices or collect fines or represent yourself as an HOA board member, we'll be pursuing legal action against you for fraud." Patricia stormed out, followed by Kenneth and Deborah. Through the window, we could see her screaming into her phone in the parking lot before peeling out in her Lexus. The room erupted in applause after she left. People were hugging and high-fiving like we just won the Super Bowl. I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. The chicken situation wasn't fully resolved yet because I still wanted to get the agricultural exemption, but at least I didn't have Patricia breathing down my neck anymore. The new board held its first official meeting the following week. One of the first items on the agenda was revising the community covenants to bring them into line with modern sensibilities and local laws. The prohibition on chickens was removed, replaced with reasonable regulations that required coops to be maintained in sanitary conditions and located at least 25 feet from neighboring property lines. Commercial vehicle restrictions were loosened. The requirement for HOA approval of any external home modifications was changed to only require approval for major structural changes or additions. Meanwhile, I was still waiting to hear back about my agricultural exemption application. 6 weeks had passed, then 7, then 8. I called the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship several times to check on the status, but I kept getting told that my application was under review. Finally, in late July, almost 10 weeks after I'd submitted the application, a letter arrived from the state. My hands were shaking as I opened it, half expecting it to be a rejection. Instead, it was an approval. The letter stated that my property had been granted an agricultural exemption under Iowa Code Chapter 352 for the purpose of small-scale poultry farming. The exemption provided certain protections, including exemption from local restrictions that conflicted with the state's right to farm provisions. The letter specifically noted that homeowners association covenants that prohibited agricultural activities could not be enforced against properties with valid agricultural exemptions. I read the letter 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Even though the HOA had already changed its rules, this exemption meant that even if Patricia or someone like her tried to ban chickens in the future, they couldn't touch me. My right to keep chickens was now protected by state law. I called Michael immediately to share the news. "That's fantastic," he said. "This is actually a pretty significant development. I don't think a lot of people realize that these agricultural exemptions are available for small-scale urban farming. You might have just opened the door for a lot of other people in similar situations." "What happens with the lawsuit now?" I asked. "Well, The HOA has already rescinded the fines and Patricia's no longer on the board, so there's nothing left to fight about. I'll file a motion to dismiss as moot. If Patricia wants to continue her counterclaim, she can, but she'd be doing it as an individual, not on behalf of the HOA, and she'd have a very hard time proving any damages. The lawsuit was dismissed 2 weeks later. Patricia's attorney filed a notice withdrawing from her case, apparently having realized that there was no path to victory and possibly concerned about getting paid. Patricia tried to continue on her own, filing some rambling documents that made wild accusations about conspiracy and corruption, but the judge dismissed everything with prejudice. In late August, Frank Morrison called me. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Patricia's house just went up for sale. Looks like she's leaving the neighborhood." "Good riddance," I said, though part of me felt a little sorry for her. She'd worked herself into such a state of righteous anger that she'd ended up losing everything she'd been fighting for. The new HOA board was everything the old one wasn't. They were transparent, reasonable, and actually focused on maintaining the neighborhood rather than bullying homeowners. They published a monthly newsletter, held regular meetings that people actually attended, and even organized a neighborhood barbecue in September where people could meet their neighbors and build community. At that barbecue, I brought several dozen eggs from my chickens and a poster board with photos of the whole saga, from the first notice I'd received from Patricia to the agricultural exemption letter from the state. People kept coming up to thank me for fighting and to tell me I'd inspired them to stand up for themselves in other areas of their lives. Robert Chang, the plumber who'd been fined for his work van, told me he'd filed a complaint with the state attorney general's office about Patricia's fine collection practices. I talked to a lawyer, and he said what she was doing might actually constitute fraud since she was collecting money on behalf of an HOA that wasn't even in good standing with the state. The AG's office is investigating. That investigation eventually bore fruit. In October, I got a call from an investigator with the Iowa Attorney General's office asking me questions about the fines Patricia had tried to collect. I told him everything I knew and provided copies of all the documentation I had, including the notices she'd sent and the threatening emails. The investigator explained that they were looking into whether Patricia had violated Iowa's Consumer Fraud Act by collecting fines and fees under false pretenses. If the HOA wasn't properly organized and didn't follow its own bylaws, then any money she collected might be considered fraudulent, he said. "We're still gathering evidence, but there could be criminal charges." I wasn't sure how I felt about that. On the one hand, Patricia had been a nightmare to deal with and had caused me and many other homeowners a lot of stress and financial hardship. On the other hand, I wasn't sure she deserved to be criminally prosecuted. Maybe she'd just been misguided and power-hungry rather than actually malicious. But as the investigation progressed and more information came out, it became clear that Patricia's actions had been worse than I'd realized. The Attorney General's office discovered that she'd collected over $200,000 in fines from Meadowbrook Estates, homeowners over the 18 months she'd been acting as HOA president. The money had gone into an account that only she controlled, and while some of it had been used for legitimate HOA expenses like lawn care for common areas, a significant portion had been spent on personal expenses. In December, Patricia Hendricks was arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft by deception and fraudulent practices. The story made the local news, and I got calls from reporters asking for interviews. I declined most of them, not wanting to pile on now that Patricia was facing serious legal consequences. but I did provide a statement explaining that I hoped the case would serve as a warning to other HOA board members who might be tempted to abuse their authority. Patricia eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay restitution to all the homeowners she defrauded, and banned from serving on any HOA board in Iowa for 10 years. It was a relatively light sentence, all things considered, but the judge seemed to take into account that this was her first offense and that she'd cooperated with the investigation once she realized how much trouble she was in. By the time Patricia was sentenced, Meadowbrook Estates had transformed into a completely different community. The new HOA board had used the money recovered from Patricia's fraud to make actual improvements to the neighborhood, including new playground equipment for the common area, better lighting on the walking paths, and a community garden where homeowners could rent small plots to grow vegetables. My chickens became something of a neighborhood attraction. Kids would stop by on their way home from school to watch them pecking around in their run, and I started giving informal lessons on chicken care to families who were thinking about getting their own. 3 other homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates got chickens after seeing how well mine were doing, and all of them followed my lead in applying for agricultural exemptions from the state. The agricultural exemption turned out to be useful in another way I hadn't expected. Because my property was now classified as agricultural, I qualified for certain tax benefits that actually saved me several $100s a year. I also learned that the exemption gave me additional rights to use my property for agricultural purposes, which meant I could expand my operation if I wanted to. I didn't plan to turn my backyard into a full farm or anything, but it was nice to know I had options. Emma and Jake loved visiting more than ever because they felt like they were part of something special. They'd tell their friends at school about how their dad had fought the HOA and won, making it sound much more dramatic than it had actually been. Jake started talking about maybe becoming a lawyer when he grew up so he could help people who were being treated unfairly. Emma announced that she wanted to be a farmer and have 100 chickens. On a Saturday morning in March, almost a year after Patricia had first knocked on my door, I was out in my backyard with Emma and Jake collecting eggs when Frank Morrison stopped by. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure," I said, sending the kids inside with the egg basket. Frank sat down on one of the patio chairs and looked around at the chicken coop, the garden beds I'd built, and the compost bin tucked in the corner of the yard. "You know, when you first moved in here, I never would have guessed you'd end up transforming this whole neighborhood." "I didn't transform anything," I said. "I just wanted to keep my chickens." "That's not true, and you know it," Frank said. "You stood up to a bully when most people would have just given in. You organized the homeowners and showed everyone that we didn't have to accept being pushed around. And you found a legal pathway that's helping other people now, too. Those 3 families that got chickens after you. 2 of them told me they never would have tried if you hadn't shown them it was possible." I felt myself getting a little choked up. I was just doing what I thought was right. "That's exactly my point," Frank said. "Most people know what's right, but they don't act on it because it's too hard or too risky or too expensive. You did, and it made a difference." After Frank left, I sat there for a while thinking about everything that had happened over the past year. It had been stressful and expensive and frustrating, but Frank was right. It had been worth it, not just because I got to keep my chickens, though that was certainly nice, but because I'd learned something important about standing up for yourself and your rights, even when it would be easier to just go along to get along. The chickens came over to the fence of their run and made their soft clucking sounds, hoping I had treats for them. I went to the kitchen and came back with some leftover lettuce, which they attacked with enthusiasm. Watching them peck and scratch and go about their simple chicken lives, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. My phone buzzed with a text from my ex-wife. "Kids said you're in a good mood. Things going well," I smiled and typed back. "Yeah, things are going really well." That summer, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA organized its first annual neighborhood block party. It was a huge event with food trucks, a bounce house for kids, and live music from a local band. The new board had done an amazing job pulling it together, and it seemed like the entire neighborhood showed up. I manned a booth about urban chicken keeping, with posters explaining the benefits and requirements, information about applying for agricultural exemptions, and of course, 2 of my hens in a temporary enclosure so people could see them up close. The booth was surprisingly popular. I must have talked to 50 families over the course of the afternoon, and at least a dozen said they were seriously considering getting chickens of their own. Robert Chang stopped by with his kids and thanked me again for fighting the HOA. "I got my money back from the restitution," he said. "All of it. And you know what? I'm parking my van in the driveway every single day now, and nobody says a word about it." Susan Delacroix, who was now the HOA vice president, brought me a plate of vegetables from her front yard garden, which she'd replanted bigger than ever. "I wanted you to have these," she said. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't been willing to fight." As the sun started to set and the band played their final song, I looked around at my neighbors laughing and talking and enjoying themselves, at kids running around playing tag, at Emma and Jake showing other kids how to gently pet the chickens, and I felt grateful for all of it. The fight with Patricia had been terrible at the time, but it had brought this community together in a way that never would have happened otherwise. Later that night, after I'd gotten home and put the chickens to bed and was sitting on my back porch with a beer, I thought about that first morning when Patricia had shown up at my door. If someone had told me then that I'd end up taking on the HOA, organizing a homeowner revolt, getting an agricultural exemption from the state, and indirectly leading to criminal charges against the HOA president, I would have thought they were crazy. I just wanted to keep my chickens. I hadn't set out to be some kind of neighborhood activist or HOA reformer. But sometimes life pushes you into situations where you have to make a choice between backing down or standing up, and the choice you make defines who you are. I'd chosen to stand up, not because I was particularly brave or righteous, but because giving in felt wrong. Because my chickens mattered to me, and my kids loved them, and I'd followed all the actual laws that were supposed to govern what I could do on my own property. The agricultural exemption letter was framed and hanging on my wall now, right next to a photo of the chickens. It was a reminder that sometimes when powerful people try to push you around, there are tools and resources and legal protections available if you're willing to look for them. That you don't have to accept someone else's version of what the rules are, especially when they're wrong. My neighbor across the street, a young couple who'd moved in a few months earlier, had put up a chicken coop the previous week. I'd helped them build it and walked them through the agricultural exemption application process. They had 4 chickens now, and this morning I'd seen their 5-year-old daughter carefully collecting eggs, her face lit up with joy. This was what it was all about. Not the legal battles or the drama with Patricia, or even the victory at the special meeting. It was about people being able to use their property in reasonable ways that brought them happiness, about communities coming together to support each other, and about standing up to bullies who tried to control others for their own gratification. The chickens made their final settling sounds from the coop as darkness fell. In a few hours, they'd wake up with the sun and start another day of laying eggs, scratching in the dirt, and living their chicken lives. and I'd be there to take care of them, grateful for everything they'd brought into my life. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that the agricultural exemption letter had been the key that ended the debate, but it wasn't the thing that mattered most. What mattered was that I'd been willing to fight for what was right, that my neighbors had rallied together to reclaim their community, and that we'd created something better in the process. Patricia's attempt to ban my chickens had backfired spectacularly, leading not just to the protection of my right to keep them, but to a complete transformation of how the HOA operated and how the neighborhood functioned as a community. The state agricultural exemption had given me legal protection that superseded the HOA rules, ensuring that no future board could try what Patricia had tried. But more importantly, the whole experience had shown everyone in Meadowbrook Estates that they had power, that they didn't have to accept abuse from people in authority, and that working together they could create the kind of community they actually wanted to live in. As I sat there in the darkness, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of the highway, I thought about all the other people out there who might be dealing with similar situations. HOAs that had been taken over by petty tyrants who used the rules as weapons to bully their neighbors. People who just wanted to live their lives and use their property in reasonable ways, but who were being harassed and threatened with fines and liens. I hoped that my story might reach some of them, might show them that there were ways to fight back. That state agricultural exemptions existed for exactly this kind of situation. That HOAs had to follow their own rules and state laws, and if they didn't, they could be challenged. That organizing with your neighbors was one of the most powerful tools available to ordinary people dealing with institutional abuse. The next morning was Sunday, and Emma and Jake were coming over for the whole day. I had promised to teach them how to make fresh pasta using the eggs from the chickens, and Jake wanted to work on the raised garden bed we'd been building together. Simple, ordinary activities that had become special because of the peace and stability I'd fought so hard to protect. As I let the chickens out of their coop and watched them spread out across the yard, pecking at the ground and stretching their wings in the morning sun, I smiled. These 6 chickens had changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. They taught me about resilience and standing up for yourself. They'd connected me with my community and helped me build relationships with neighbors I might never have gotten to know otherwise. They'd given my kids hands-on lessons about responsibility and where food comes from. And yes, they provided delicious fresh eggs every morning. Patricia Hendricks had tried to take all of that away because she believed she had the power to control what happened on other people's property. She'd been wrong, and now she was dealing with the consequences of that mistake. I didn't take any pleasure in her legal troubles, but I didn't regret standing up to her either. Some battles need to be fought, even when they're difficult and costly and uncertain. The agricultural exemption letter had been the final piece of the puzzle, the trump card that definitively ended any legal debate about my right to keep chickens. But the real victory had come earlier, when my neighbors and I took back control of our HOA and established that we would govern ourselves fairly and reasonably, treating each other with respect and dignity rather than using rules as weapons. I heard Emma and Jake's voices as my ex-wife's car pulled into the driveway. The kids came running into the backyard, and Emma immediately went to check on the chickens while Jake asked if he could help me clean out the coop. "Sure, buddy," I said, handing him the rake. "You know, when I first got these chickens, I never imagined they'd lead to everything that's happened over the past year." "I'm glad you didn't get rid of them, Dad," Jake said seriously. "That would have been wrong." "Yeah," I agreed. "It would have been." We worked together in the morning sun, cleaning the coop and refreshing the bedding while Emma scattered scratch grains for the chickens. It was peaceful and satisfying work, and I felt more content than I had in years. The agricultural exemption letter was safe in my filing cabinet, ready to be produced if anyone ever questioned my right to keep chickens again. But I didn't think that would happen. The new HOA board understood that homeowners had rights, and that those rights needed to be respected. The neighborhood had learned the lessons of the Patricia era, and nobody wanted to go back to that kind of authoritarian nonsense. As we finished up with the chickens and headed inside to start making pasta, I took one last look at the coop and the yard where so much had happened. This was my property, my home, and my right to use it reasonably had been protected by standing up for myself, and by a state agricultural exemption that recognized the value of small-scale farming even in suburban neighborhoods. Patricia had tried to ban my chickens. The state agricultural exemption letter had ended the debate, and in the process, an entire community had been transformed for the better. It was a good outcome, one worth fighting for, and I'd do it all again if I had to, but hopefully I wouldn't have to. Hopefully the chickens and I could just live our lives in peace, providing eggs and lessons and joy to my family, and anyone else who wanted to pay attention to 6 ordinary hens scratching around in a backyard in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The pasta turned out perfectly, rich and yellow from the fresh eggs. We ate lunch on the patio, watching the chickens through the window, and talked about plans for expanding the garden and maybe adding a few fruit trees in the fall. Simple plans for a simple life, no longer under threat from an overbearing HOA president with delusions of authority. That evening, after taking the kids home, I sat down at my computer and drafted an email to the Iowa Department of Agriculture. I wanted to thank them for processing my agricultural exemption application, and to suggest that they do more outreach to let urban and suburban residents know about the program. A lot of people would benefit from having the same protections I'd gained, and many of them probably had no idea the exemptions existed. I also wrote a detailed post for the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners' Rights Facebook group, explaining the entire process of getting the agricultural exemption and offering to help anyone else who wanted to apply. Within an hour, I had 15 comments from people asking questions and expressing interest. The ripple effects of standing up to Patricia just kept spreading, creating positive change in ways I couldn't have predicted. And it all started because I'd refused to get rid of 6 chickens that brought happiness to my life and my children's lives. As I got ready for bed that night, I heard the chickens settling down in their coop for the night, making their quiet evening sounds. I smiled and turned out the light, feeling grateful for everything they'd brought into my world and satisfied that I'd fought the fight that needed to be fought. The agricultural exemption letter had ended the debate. The community organizing had removed a tyrant from power. The legal system had held Patricia accountable for her fraud. And in the end, justice had prevailed, chickens and all. Sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest changes. 6 chickens had changed my life, transformed my neighborhood, and taught me lessons about courage and community that I'd carry with me forever. And they were still there every morning, laying eggs and living their lives, completely oblivious to the important role they'd played in all of it. That was fine with me. They didn't need to know they were heroes. They just needed to be chickens, and I just needed to take care of them and appreciate what they'd brought into my world. Everything else was just details. The story of how one man's fight to keep his chickens became a battle against an abusive HOA and ended with a complete transformation of a community. It was a good story, and I was proud to have lived it. But more than that, I was just happy to have my chickens, my kids, my home, and my peace. That was all I'd ever wanted, and thanks to persistence, legal protections, and a community that came together when it mattered most, that was exactly what I had.